Greetings and welcome. I'm Dan Little, Professor of Philosophy, and I'm very glad to welcome you to Honors 300, the Four Trials course. As you know, this is the gateway course for the Honors program. It is organized around the lives and dilemmas of a number of important historical figures. More important than these particular individuals, though, the course is intended to bring focus on the dilemmas that confront ordinary people in society, and to raise some of the issues of morality, justice, and good and evil that arise when people live together and seek to pursue their lives and commitments within a given set of political and social institutions. The figures that we will study are very diverse across history and also across continent. We begin with Socrates, the Athenian philosopher who raised questions about how to live, what is justice, and what is a good life, and who was accused of impiety and of corrupting the youth with his many questions. Socrates was condemned to death in 399 BCE by a majority of his fellow citizens in Athens. We next consider the life and death of a 20th century French historian, Marc Bloch, who was one of the most innovative historians in France in the 1930s, who fought in the French army in World War I and World War II, who was evacuated with the British forces at Dunkirk after the fall of France, and who returned to France to fight with the resistance in Lyon. He was betrayed, arrested, tortured, and executed by Klaus Barbie, the notorious Gestapo boss in the Vichy regime in France. Bloch was an Alsatian Jewish man who fought for France, who championed the intellectual discipline of history, and who died at the hands of the Gestapo. We will also spend a week reading about the programs of genocide and extermination waged by the Nazi state against the Jews of Europe, and we'll find that recent historians have provided important new ideas about how best to understand the Holocaust. The map represented here of the Bloodlands of Central Europe will be an organizing feature. This is taken from a recent historian, Tim SNYDER. Then our focus shifts to the life, activism, and trial of Susan B. Anthony, one of the best-known and tireless advocates for women's rights to vote in the United States. A few weeks ago, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, establishing the right to vote for women. The United States is a democracy, ruled by the people, and yet at its beginnings, African American men and women, slaves, former slaves, Native Americans, and all women were denied the rights of voting and political participation. We will see that Susan B. Anthony was part of a social movement for equality, a movement that continues to the present. These images are indicative of a march for women's suffrage in Washington, D.C., March 3rd, 1913. We next take a step back in time to Italy in the early part of the 17th century to the trial of Galileo on the charge of heresy by the Vatican. Galileo is credited with inventing the telescope and thus enabling observational astronomy, and he offered observational confirmation of the heliocentric theory advanced a century earlier by Copernicus. This case, too, is a signal moment in the history of humanity. It raises the question of the validity of science, the conflict between the individual's conscience and the moral authority of religion and other authorities, and the question for all of us of how we should form our beliefs about the world, using evidence or relying on dogma and authority. The central debate here was over the structure of the universe. Was the Earth the center of the universe, or was the Sun the center of the system of planets that could be observed in motion relative to the Earth? Ptolemy and religious doctrine held the first view, whereas Copernicus and Galileo held the second view. In order to reconcile the geocentric view of the motions of the planets with increasingly accurate measurements of their motions, it was necessary to introduce epicycles into their motions. Our next topic is the question of the struggle against the system of apartheid in South Africa and the struggle against racial inequality and discrimination more generally, through consideration of the life and trial of Nelson Mandela in 1963 and 64. Mandela was accused of conspiracy to overthrow the state and sentenced to life imprisonment. Mandela served 27 years in prison before his release. Apartheid fell. Like the case of Susan B. Anthony, the struggle against apartheid was both an individual struggle of individuals like Nelson Mandela and the struggle of a movement. The struggle against apartheid in South Africa was a global struggle, and it took place simultaneous with the struggle against the Jim Crow system of racial inequality in the United States. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955. The Montgomery bus boycott took place in 1955 and 56, and the March on Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis took place in 1965. We end the course by returning to the period of Nazi genocide and consider several figures whose fates shed light on Nazi tyranny and murder. The image represented here is a shooting pit in which teams of soldiers and policemen were assigned to kill Jewish men, women, and children in the Ukraine in the hundreds and even thousands where they lived. During this segment, we will read a book called EICHMANN in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt. Arendt was a German Jewish philosopher who fled Germany in 1933, the year that Hitler came to power, lived in France for 8 years, and then emigrated to the United States. Her writings on political philosophy, totalitarianism, and the state are regarded as leading contributions to philosophy in the 20th century. Arendt describes and interprets the trials of Adolf Eichmann on charges of crimes against humanity. Eichmann defended himself by claiming that his actions towards facilitating the murders of thousands of Jews were to be excused because he was following orders, a claim that Hannah Arendt describes as the banality of evil. But we also consider the life and murder of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Protestant theologian who strenuously opposed the crimes of the Nazi regime against Jews and others, and who was executed for his involvement in an assassination plot against Hitler. Bonhoeffer spent about a year as a young man in the United States in 1930, where he was exposed to the systematic racial inequalities that the United States perpetuated. Each of these cases involves specific human beings in troubled times, and they also involve social institutions that imposed their will on individuals for a variety of reasons. Individuals make choices that have fateful consequences for themselves and their families, and societies become more democratic and equal or more cruel and authoritarian. Through this course, you will gain some of the most important skills and intellectual abilities that are valued in the honors program. The ability to read complicated, sometimes contradictory texts, the ability to assess historical evidence, the ability to think about the moral situation of the individual, and the ability to think critically and soundly about issues of social justice and legitimacy. You will be in a position to consider the famous idea put forward by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Is this optimism justified? And perhaps you will have some better ways of thinking about how you and your society can work to ensure that this is how things will work out in our futures. Again, I welcome you, and I look forward to getting to know you throughout the semester and beyond.